Okay, so hello and welcome everybody to this FODMAP webinar that I'm presenting today. I apologise if I'm looking over here. I do have a disclaimer, I have some notes up here because I want to make sure that I tell you everything, don't miss anything out. So I apologise if I'm looking up here a little bit. Welcome today. The aim of today is to give you guys a little bit more information. There's quite a lot to get through, but I should be talking for about half an hour to 35 minutes, and then we'll move on to the Q&A session afterwards. So what we want to do is give you guys more information about what FODMAPs are, which some of you might know already, how the low FODMAP diet works, what the dangers are of the low FODMAP diet, whether the low FODMAP diet is right for you or whether there are other things that we should be looking at instead. Going over some misconceptions about gluten and dairy, which I think are the biggest misconceptions when we're looking at the low FODMAP diet. What you can eat on the low FODMAP diet, and also where you can find useful evidence-based resources. I'm just going to let a couple of more people in. Fab. So before we delve in, I just want to introduce myself and explain who I am and why I think that you should listen to me or care about what I'm saying. And I hope that by the end of today, if this teaches you nothing else, it will teach you to question who you listen to, who you're taking advice from, and actually that it's okay for you to ask people to justify why you should listen to them, because this is your health that's on the line. So my name is Katie. I am a registered nutritionist, and I'm going to go into a little bit more about what that means in a little while. So I did a bachelor's degree in biochemistry, and then I went on to do a master's degree in nutrition. And I am currently in my third year of my PhD in nutrition. So apparently I just can't leave uni. But in addition to this, I also work as a registered nutritionist at Andra, seeing clients, and I work mainly in gut health and IBS. That's kind of my area of specialization. So let's get into it. So many of you will know this already, but when we're thinking about FODMAPs, this stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. Now, the key here is the word fermentable. And what we mean by this is the ability of food to pass through the stomach and through the small intestine intact, i.e. without being broken down, and therefore reach the large intestine intact, where it then sits and ferments. Now, this doesn't happen in people who don't have gut issues, because they would break that food down and so it wouldn't reach the large intestine intact. With people who might have intolerances, it reaches the large intestine, it's not broken down, and it's when it's in that unbroken down form that it sits in the large intestine and ferments. This fermentation process draws water and gas into the large intestine, which causes things like bloating, very gurgly stomach. It can cause stomach pains, and then it can also cause diarrhea and loose stools in some people. As a whole, this process takes a few hours, usually 12 to 24 hours. And in people who it might happen a bit more quickly, we wouldn't expect it any quicker than 6 hours. So when we're thinking about symptoms as a result of intolerances, we're not thinking about what you just ate, an hour or two ago. We're thinking about what you ate hours ago or even yesterday, if it is that FODMAPs are causing your issues, which obviously gets a whole lot more complicated, because then what you ate yesterday is a whole range of different foods, maybe not just as compared to a meal that you've just eaten. Actually, we are thinking about yesterday or even the day before in some people. So oligosaccharides have the longest chain length out of all of the FODMAPs, and they are a type of fiber. We don't have an enzyme that can break down oligosaccharides. This is why we refer to them as a type of fiber, because fiber, by definition, is something that we can't break down. However, the gut microbiome, so the bacteria that we have within our gut, can break down types of fiber, and the gut microbiome can break down oligosaccharides. Now, oligosaccharides are what we call prebiotic, and I'll go into a little bit more about what that means in a little while. But it might be that some people who have issues after eating oligosaccharides, it may be that in those people, they don't have enough of the types of gut bacteria that break down those oligosaccharides. So in those people who might be lacking some of these gut bacteria, the oligosaccharides may then reach the large intestine undigested because there hasn't been the presence of the gut bacteria to break them down, which allows them to then sit in the large intestine and ferment and cause these symptoms. Then we've got the disaccharide and the monosaccharide FODMAPs. These are both sugars. So the disaccharide FODMAP is lactose, which is a sugar that we find within milk. And the monosaccharide sugar is fructose, which is a sugar that we find in fruit and then some of the foods like honey. And then finally, we have the polyols. These are also sugars and they have an alcohol unit attached to them. It's just another type of sugar that we find in some fruits and vegetables. And we also tend to find that they get added to things like sugar-free sweets and chewing gums and things like that because they taste sweet. So the stages of the low FODMAP diet. This looks a little bit crazy, but I'm going to go through it. So we have 3 stages to the low FODMAP diet, which I'm hoping that most of you or all of you already know. However, we do unfortunately see clients in the clinic who haven't realized this and have stayed on the restrictive phase or the elimination phase or phase 1 for a number of months, thinking that the low FODMAP diet means that you eliminate all of these things and then you carry on like that for a long time. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what happens to our bodies when we do that in a little while. So first of all, we have stage 1, the elimination or the restriction phase, and it normally lasts around 4 to 6 weeks for most people. And this stage involves cutting out all 4 of the groups of FODMAPs that we've just been through in the previous slide. And the idea of that is to bring total FODMAP intake down to a very low level. So that's what is represented by this blue line here at the bottom. This blue line at the bottom in this first stage is showing FODMAP intake being very low. And as a result of that, hopefully what happens is this red line here represents your symptoms. As a result of bringing your FODMAP intake down here, what we hope to see is that symptoms then do this and they come right down as a result below your symptom threshold. Now, what we mean by symptom threshold is your ability to feel the presence of your symptoms. Now, IBS is classed as a syndrome, not a disease. And what we mean by that is that we don't think we can cure it. And so the aim is to manage symptoms long term. So the aim is to treat the symptoms, to get the symptoms down below this threshold level. And if we can, keep these symptoms below the threshold level for the rest of your life. And therefore, they don't come into this threshold level or surpass this threshold level, and therefore you're not aware of the presence of them, if that makes sense. So then we move on to the re-challenge phase, which usually takes around 6 to 8 weeks in most people. So these blue step-ups here represent the re-challenge of a FODMAP group in increasing amounts over a 3-day period. So this would be day 1, this would be day 2, and this would be day 3. And the FODMAP intake would start here, then go up a little bit on day 2, and then go up a little bit more on day 3. Now, as you can see, this FODMAP reintroduction has caused an increase in symptoms. And therefore, we would conclude that this FODMAP is not tolerated very well by you. We want to wait until symptoms come right back down again before we move on to the next re-challenge, because we don't want to start the next re-challenge here, because if you start to get symptoms, you don't know if it's still ongoing symptoms from the last challenge or whether it's new symptoms from the new re-challenge. So we want to let symptoms come right back down. Then we move on to re-challenge 2, and this one doesn't seem to cause any symptoms, so we would say that this FODMAP is tolerated well. And then we move on to another re-challenge, and again, this one seems to cause symptoms, so then we would say that this FODMAP is not tolerated very well. However, it gets a lot more complicated than that. So not only do we say whether you are tolerant or intolerant to something, When we're thinking about tolerance, it is very, very rarely as black and white as you have tolerance or you don't have tolerance to a food. What we tend to find is that people fit along a scale between those two things. So somebody who has a very high level of tolerance to a food and is all the way over on this end of the scale, they would be somebody who could eat buckets and buckets and buckets of a type of food and it would just never cause them any issues. Whereas someone on this side of the scale would maybe have a really small amount of that food and it would cause them issues. As I say, it's very rare that we find people on one or the other side of that scale. We tend to find that people sit somewhere along that scale. Their tolerance level varies from person to person. So if you look at these two re-challenges here, we can see that because this first re-challenge doesn't really seem to cause symptoms until day 3. So actually, even though we would say that this food isn't tolerated that well, we would probably conclude that actually the amount that you ate on day 1 is probably fine. So it might be that if you only eat a small of that amount of that food, you'd probably be okay. Or it might be that you can't eat that food 2 consecutive days in a row, but if you only eat it a couple of days a week and then not eaten 2 consecutive days in a row, then it probably won't cause symptoms. This re-challenge, however, symptoms are starting to go up at the end of day 1. So we would conclude that this food is not very well tolerated by you at all. So your tolerance level to this food here would be lower than your tolerance level to this food here. I hope that makes sense, but it can get quite complicated. The other thing that can make it even more complicated is combinations of FODMAPs. So some people challenge one type of FODMAP and they don't have any issues. And then they separately challenge a different FODMAP and they don't have any issues. However, when they then put those two FODMAPs in combination with each other, they suddenly start to cause issues and take you above that threshold level. So this re-challenge phase requires a lot of time, a lot of planning, a lot of organization, staying on top of food and symptom diaries to really get a deep understanding of not just are you tolerant or are you not tolerant to a food, but how tolerant are you to each and every one of those foods? Can you eat them consecutive days in a row? Can we combine different foods together? And does that still not cause you issues, or does it cause you issues at that point? So it can get very complicated. Hopefully, by the end of the re-challenge phase, we do have an idea of all of that stuff and we can reintroduce the FODMAPs that you seem to be okay with. So that's why the FODMAP blue line here is a little bit higher than it was over here in phase 1. Over here, it's a bit higher because we've reintroduced the ones that you're okay with and that you seem to be tolerant to. And hopefully your symptoms as a result of that kind of just level off and stay the same and stay below this symptom threshold. That's the aim. What I will also say is sometimes it's not impossible to develop intolerances to FODMAPs that you didn't have when you did the low FODMAP diet, if that makes sense. So when we get to the end of the low FODMAP diet, we can set you off on your way and we know roughly what you're okay with, but that's not to say that years down the line, something else might cause an issue. Hopefully it doesn't, and for most people it doesn't, but we can see that happening sometimes. So that's the stages of the low FODMAP diet. What are the dangers of the low FODMAP diet? Are there any dangers of the low FODMAP diet? So we have said that oligosaccharides, that first row in that table of FODMAPs, is what we call a prebiotic. A prebiotic is a type of fiber that we cannot break down. And in order for a fiber to be classed as a prebiotic, because not all fiber is prebiotic, in order for a fiber to be classed as prebiotic, it has to be resistant to digestion in the stomach. So it has to reach the large intestine, which is where our gut bacteria are, for them to be able to break it down. So it first has to be resistant to digestion in the stomach. And then it has to be able to selectively feed our gut microbiome. Those are the two things that need to happen for something to be a prebiotic. So oligosaccharides we class as a prebiotic. And they are extremely important for our gut microbiome. I always tell people to think of prebiotics as food for your gut microbiome. So probiotics, those are when we take live bacteria. So we take capsules that have live bacteria. I always tell people to think of those as friends for your gut microbiome. And prebiotics are food for your gut microbiome. So these oligosaccharides are prebiotic. Our gut microbiome needs prebiotics to stay alive, to stay healthy, and we need our gut microbiome to be healthy in order for us to be healthy. So what we've said is prebiotics, oligosaccharides are prebiotic, prebiotics are food for our gut microbiome, and that not all fiber is prebiotic. It's these specific types of fiber. Now, when we eliminate these types of fiber from our diet, we are essentially starving our gut microbiome. This is okay for short periods of time, such as the 4 to 6 weeks of the elimination phase, or stage 1 of the low FODMAP diet, but we do still have to be careful during this stage 1 of the low FODMAP diet that you are still getting other types of prebiotics in your diet that don't fall under the FODMAP category. So not all prebiotics fall under the FODMAP category. So we have to make sure that because you're not getting the prebiotics that do fall under the FODMAP category, you're getting enough of those prebiotics that don't fall under that FODMAP category that you can still eat. As mentioned previously, we have seen patients who have stayed on phase 1 long term who haven't realized this about prebiotics, and so haven't made sure that they're incorporating other prebiotics into their diet. And what can happen when we get this is we get this gut microbiome starvation. And this gut microbiome starvation can eventually lead to damage to our gut microbiome. And that can lead to worsening of IBS symptoms. Now, we already know that people who have IBS tend to have differences in their gut microbiome compared to people who don't suffer with any gastrointestinal issues. So there's lots of studies that have looked into this and taken swabs of lots and lots of people's poo. And we know that people who have IBS have a different gut microbiome to people who don't. Therefore, if somebody already has IBS and potentially already has alterations to their gut microbiome, then undergoes gut microbiome starvation, what we can see as a result of that is potential worsening of those IBS symptoms. And that can take a really, really long time to undo. So this is something we have to be super, super careful of. The other thing we have to be careful of on the elimination phase is major food groups, such as dairy, which often people do cut out as part of the elimination phase. When we think about eliminating dairy from somebody's diet, there are two main things that we worry about. The first one is calcium, and the second one is iodine. So in the UK, calcium and iodine, a big source of those two minerals in the UK is milk and dairy products. And we worry about those things, particularly if it is a woman who we are seeing who is around or post-menopausal age. So those are two nutrients that we have to be very, very careful about. And just to mention, I'm going to go into this in more detail in a little while, but cutting out dairy is not the same as cutting out lactose as part of the low FODMAP diet. So for all of these reasons, we have to determine whether the low FODMAP diet is right for somebody or whether somebody needs to try other treatment options first. So how do we know if the low FODMAP diet is right for somebody? So we want to tick 3 boxes to be able to say that you are ready to move on to try the low FODMAP diet. First of all, we want to know that that person has been to their GP and they've had some tests done to rule out anything serious. The reason for this is because the low FODMAP diet can actually mask symptoms of some more serious conditions. So things such as bowel cancer, but other things as well, the low FODMAP diet can improve symptoms of those diseases. So we want to make sure that somebody has had these things ruled out. Ideally, the patient has had blood tests and a stool sample done to rule this out. And if those have flagged anything up, then that patient may have gone on to have a colonoscopy. So we want to make sure that we've ticked that box. Next, we want to take a patient through a primary holistic intervention treatment plan. What do we mean by this? So IBS is a multifactorial syndrome. What that means is in people who have IBS, it normally means that a number of boxes needs to have been ticked. in order for the person to go on to develop IBS. So for example, one thing that we know can cause IBS is long-term use of antibiotics, because that has the ability to kill some of our gut microbiome. However, not everybody who goes on long-term antibiotics will go on to develop IBS. Only a very small number of people will. So normally that's just one box out of many boxes that needs to get ticked for somebody to go on to develop IBS. It's a whole combination of lifestyle and genetic and dietary things that tend to play into it. So it's a multifactorial disease. Therefore, research shows that the best way we can treat IBS is to take a multifactorial approach to treatment. So the primary holistic intervention involves primary dietary interventions. So this normally involves keeping a food and symptom diary, and me, for my clients, having a look over that and seeing if I can establish any patterns, as well as going through a list of foods that people with IBS tend to be intolerant to, or they tend to crop up a lot in people with IBS, and identifying which foods we're going to try eliminating and re-challenging. We also look at treating IBS from the gut microbiome point of view. So we go over what the gut microbiome is, how it works, how it can be different for people with IBS, and how we can treat IBS through the gut microbiome. And then finally, we go through the gut-brain axis treatment approach. So again, what the gut-brain axis is, how it can go wrong in people with IBS, and how we can try and treat IBS through the gut-brain axis. So that is a holistic primary treatment plan. Now, I did an entire webinar on the holistic primary intervention treatment plan a couple of weeks ago. If you would like access to the recording of that webinar, please do let me know. I can send that over to you. So if you want access to that, you can have that, because I'm not going to go into that in detail today, because obviously we're here to talk about FODMAPs, but that's the primary dietary, the primary treatment plan. We want someone to ideally have been taken through that. Lastly, and final thing that we want to tick is ideally we want to make sure that the patient has ongoing support from an appropriate professional. And this is because of the things that we discussed in this previous slide, all of the things that we have to be careful of. Now, unfortunately, this isn't always accessible, and we see that most of the time this isn't the case. And a lot of the time people get told to do the low FODMAP diet without being offered the appropriate support, especially through the NHS, or that the wait time for referral is very, very long. Some people afford help privately. Those are the patients who I get to see, but not everybody can access that. And that is essentially why we're here today. Ideally, we want someone to have ongoing support throughout the whole process, but at the very least, we want people to have something like what I'm doing today to give people education about what you need to be aware of. So we hopefully want to tick that box as well. So if someone's had tests via their GP or their gastroenterologist, they've been through all of the primary interventions, they've not achieved an improvement of symptoms, or sometimes people do achieve an improvement in symptoms from the primary approaches, but they feel that they can still get more, or if they haven't improved at all, and they have some level of support, then this is the time when we move on to the low FODMAP diet. So this is the time when I would look at somebody and say, okay, yeah, the low FODMAP diet is right for you. So moving on, we're going to talk about gluten and dairy, because these are, in my opinion, the two biggest misconceptions in IBS and in the low FODMAP diet. So a lot of people see lactose as one of the 4 FODMAPs and immediately think that they need to cut out dairy in order to get through phase 1. Dairy-free diets are actually for people who have a cow's milk protein allergy, where any food containing dairy and therefore milk protein needs to be cut out of their diet to avoid an allergic reaction. People with a dairy allergy normally can't tolerate even the tiniest amount of dairy, because the tiniest amount of protein gets picked up. And when somebody has an allergy and this tiniest little bit gets detected by the immune system, it causes symptoms such as vomiting, diarrhea, skin rashes, swelling, and then in really severe cases, we get anaphylaxis where the throat closes. So people who have IBS who are sensitive to dairy, or people who are following the low FODMAP diet, may be intolerant to lactose, which is a sugar that we find in milk. So we've got two very different things here. We've got a protein and we've got a sugar. And dairy does not need to be cut out of the diet in order to follow the first phase. And if you've identified that lactose seems to cause you an issue, dairy still doesn't need to be cut out of the diet. Lactose simply needs to be reduced to a level where it doesn't cause symptoms. And actually, this can look quite different from person to person. And we've said people fit along this scale. Some people can tolerate, a decent amount of cheese. Some people can tolerate the amount of milk that you might put in a cup of tea or coffee. Some people can't. It looks different to different people. So decreasing lactose consumption would involve switching from a cow's milk to a lactose-free milk. You can opt for a plant-based milk. However, the two important things to look out for, as I said, are calcium and iodine. Some brands do supplement their plant-based milks with calcium and iodine. However, I will say it's not normally to the level that it is found in cow's milk. But lactose-free milk is essentially exactly the same as normal milk. It's just had the lactase enzyme added. So it still has all the vitamins and minerals that normal milk has. The same with yogurt, because yogurt is also high in lactose. So you would need to swap to a lactose-free yogurt. Things like cheese, however, is very low in lactose. So for example, cheese has got 2 grams per serving compared to milk, which has about 12 grams of lactose per serving. So the harder the cheese in general, the less lactose it has. So your softer cheeses like brie and things like that have more lactose. And then the harder cheeses like Parmesan have a lot less lactose. So most people who have lactose intolerant can actually still tolerate some level of cheese. So, as we've said, people with a cow's milk allergy have an allergic reaction to the protein in cow's milk. And the low FODMAP diet does not mean that you have to go dairy-free. It simply means that you need to reduce your lactose consumption. And we always recommend that somebody, if they're not vegan, we always recommend that somebody goes for a lactose-free milk and yogurt, because as I said, it contains the same vitamins and minerals as normal dairy milk and yogurt. So to summarize, the thing that causes the issue with a dairy allergy is cow's milk protein. And the thing that causes the issue with IBS with dairy sensitivity is lactose, which is a sugar. The body's reaction with the dairy allergy is an immune response, an allergic reaction. With IBS, it is not an immune response. It doesn't involve the immune system in any way. All that happens is lactose travels through all the way through the large intestine and it doesn't get broken down, and therefore it sits and ferments and draws water and gas into the bowel. The treatment for a dairy allergy is a dairy-free diet, and the treatment for IBS with a dairy sensitivity is a low lactose diet. So 2 very different things. So you might spot a bit of a pattern here. Gluten. That's the next thing I want to talk about, because this is the other one that tends to come up a lot. So gluten-free diets are required for people who have a gluten allergy. And this is an allergic response to a protein within wheat, which is called gluten. So gluten is a protein that we find in wheat. And it's otherwise known as celiac disease. So lots of us have heard of celiac disease, and that's what it means. People with this condition need to completely cut gluten out of their diet to avoid an allergic reaction. And we know that foods such as bread and pasta and cereals and things like that contain gluten. So these people opt for gluten-free alternatives to these foods. Now, also found in bread and pasta and cereals, and actually many other foods, are a group of carbohydrates called fructans, and more specifically a fiber. So fructans, this fiber, comes under the oligosaccharide group of FODMAPs. And as we've already discussed, this is a fiber. So this is very different to gluten, which is a protein. Now, just like lactose, fructans are fermentable in the large intestine if they are not broken down. So again, if they travel to the end of the large intestine and they haven't been broken down, they cause that water and gas to be drawn into the intestine and they ferment, and that causes symptoms. So again, if somebody has an issue with fructans, it doesn't involve the immune system, it doesn't involve antibodies, it's not an allergy, it's an intolerance, and it's a very, very different thing. Now, of course, there are some gluten-free products which also happen to be fructan-free because they don't contain things like wheat, barley, and rye, which contain both the gluten and the fructans. But what's really important to be aware of is that not every gluten-free product is fructan-free, and actually not many gluten-free products are fructan-free. So when people go on the low FODMAP diet, they sometimes go, oh, but I opted for a gluten-free bread and I know that bread causes issues for me, but I'm still getting symptoms. And that's all very well. But if the gluten-free bread that they've opted for also contains these fructans, because it's not the gluten that's causing the issue for these people, it's the fructans, they're still going to get the symptoms. In addition to that, we find fructans in other foods. So we find fructans in some vegetables, for example. So even if you have been lucky enough to choose a gluten-free bread that doesn't contain FODMAPs, that doesn't contain these fructans, but you're still eating fruit and veg that does contain the fructans, again, you're not going to experience the relief in symptoms because you're still having the fructans. So sometimes, yes, gluten and fructans do go hand in hand, but they don't always. And it's really important to know the difference between a gluten allergy and a fructan intolerance. So to summarize, like we did with the last one, with celiac disease, the thing that causes an issue is gluten, which is a protein. And with IBS, it's fructans, which are a fiber. The body's reaction in celiac disease is an immune response, an allergic reaction. And in IBS, the immune system is not involved whatsoever. It's nothing to do with your immune system. It's the fermentation of the fructans in the large intestine. Treatment for celiac disease is a gluten-free diet, and the treatment for IBS with sensitivity to fructans is a low fructan diet. So what can I eat on the low FODMAP diet? And it can all get very confusing. So when we're talking about this, really, we're talking about this phase 1, the elimination phase, when you're cutting all of these FODMAPs out. Now, I give this table to my clients, and you are more than welcome to use this. You'll get access to today's recording, so you'll get access to this. I find in general, it works really, really well to offer people alternatives, so the things in green, to the high FODMAP foods in red. So if somebody sees a recipe that calls for a certain ingredient, they can just look directly across and see what they can use instead of the thing that's high FODMAP. So I like to do this because I think it works really, really well to give people low FODMAP alternatives to the high FODMAP food. However, other people prefer to use things like the Monash app. The really important thing is that whatever you are using, it has come from a trusted and reliable source. I'm going to talk about websites in a little bit, and I'm sure some of you have been on websites and found differences between what different websites tell you are and aren't low FODMAP. And this is one of the issues that we come into. So it needs to be from a trusted source. That might be somewhere like Monash, or that might be from a registered nutritionist or dietitian, or from posted by a body, which I will go into in a little bit more detail in a little bit. The final thing to remember is that this phase is temporary. It's usually between 4 and 6 weeks. However, if somebody feels that they are having a relief in symptoms before that, so if someone feels a lot better after, say, 3 weeks, we can move on after 3 weeks, because as soon as those symptoms have come down below that threshold level, we're ready to move on. So 4 to 6 weeks is kind of the average. 6 weeks really is the maximum that we want to do. But if someone feels better before that, we can move on before that. It is restrictive. It makes eating out extremely difficult. It makes grabbing food extremely difficult. As we've been through, these FODMAPs are not allergens. So an intolerance and an allergy, they're very, very different things. And because they're not allergens, they're not in bold on the back of food packets. So it takes a really long time to look through it. So it can be really difficult. There's also different foods on food ingredients lists that aren't whole foods, so you might not always recognize them. Things like types of flours and chickpea flours and things like that that tend to be in foods that you don't always notice. However, what we have to do is we have to make sure that when somebody goes onto this stage, they are 100% committed and they can give it their all for the short period of time that it's required. Otherwise, we just don't see that improvement in symptoms, and we don't want to have someone stuck on this first elimination phase forever whilst they're trying to get a reduction in their symptoms. So where can you find evidence-based resources and helpful information? So as I said, some of you might have realized already from conducting your own Google searches that when we search for low FODMAP foods on Google, we find that different websites disagree on which foods are high and low FODMAP. So for example, one website may say that you can eat an apple and one website may say that you can't eat an apple. And it can get really, really confusing and make this first stage really difficult to follow. In addition to this, we're constantly battling against non-evidence-based information that gets shared online all the time. One of the problems that we come across that doesn't kind of help with this is that the term nutritionist is not protected by law. And this means that anybody can call themselves a nutritionist, whether they have any qualifications or not. So if they've got 0 qualifications, someone is still allowed and perfectly within the law to call themselves a nutritionist. And this causes issues, as I'm sure you can imagine. However, registered nutritionist is a protected title. So if somebody is a registered nutritionist, it means that they are registered under the Association for Nutrition. And this is a governed body in the UK that regulates registered nutritionists. And what it means is that these people have a minimum of a degree in nutrition. Now, dietitian is a protected title. So if somebody is called a dietitian, then that is a safe person to take advice from because that is a protected title. Nutritionists, we have to be really, really careful to make sure that they are registered professionals. So when we see information, whether that be on social media or websites, it's really important to look into the person who has written or posted what you are reading. Are they a registered nutritionist? Are they a registered dietitian? Are they a medical doctor or a gastroenterologist, or has a body such as the Association for Nutrition or the British Dietary Association or Monash posted it? Anyone can write a website article, so they're not always safe places to look. So who can we trust? Firstly, the British Dietary Association. So this is the association that regulates all of the dietitians in the UK. They sometimes have useful resources on their websites as well, and you can look for registered dietitians who specialise in this kind of thing, and they may share resources and information as well. So the British Dietary Association, who regulate dietitians, is a great place for information. Then we've got the Association for Nutrition. So this is the body that I'm registered under, and so sometimes they might give out resources, or people who are registered nutritionists might give out resources or do things like what I'm doing today to give people information. These are also safe people to take advice from because they're registered under the appropriate professionals. Finally, we have Monash University. As we know, they created the low FODMAP diet in the first place. They are constantly doing research on the low FODMAP diet and constantly putting out research and spending money on research and putting out new up-to-date information. So they are always a great place to take information from. So be very careful. Don't be afraid to ask people to justify who they are. What qualifications do they have? What are their expertise? Because as I say, this is your health that is on the line. So really you want to make sure that you are listening to the appropriate professionals. So I'm just going to leave you with this study here, which was conducted a couple of years ago, which really highlights the issues that we face in terms of people having access to support from registered professionals. So this study took a group of participants who were diagnosed with IBS, and they put them into one of 3 groups. So they put some of them into a group with one-to-one support from a registered nutrition professional. They gave some of them an app to download, and they gave some of them a leaflet containing information. Now, as you can see, the people who had the one-to-one support, so at the end of the study, they asked the people, how confident did you feel to implement the changes that you were given? And have you had an improvement in your symptoms? And as you can see, which we can probably expect, the people who had the one-to-one support had the biggest improvement in their symptoms and felt the most confident to implement the dietary changes. What's really interesting is this bottom line here, these people who were given a leaflet to take home and read. So when we look at studies on IBS or any scientific study, we have to put some people into a treatment group, but we also have to put some people into a control group. So for example, if we were looking at a new drug that we think is going to help people with IBS, we'd put them into 2 groups. We'd give some people this new drug and we'd give some people a sugar pill. And these people wouldn't know which treatment they'd had. They wouldn't know whether they were in the treatment group or whether they were in the control group. They would just get given a pill and told to take it. Now, what we tend to find in these studies is that the people in the control group, i.e. the people who take a sugar pill, we tend to find that around 40% of people will report an improvement in their symptoms, purely from psychological influence, purely from a placebo effect, which we know is a thing because we know that the gut-brain axis plays a huge role in IBS. So it makes sense. So this bottom line here, where we see given a leaflet containing information, and we see this 39% improvement, actually from a glance, that doesn't look too bad. It almost looks worth doing. You know, giving out a leaflet to people is a really cheap and easy way to get information out to people. And if it's going to help 40% of people, it almost seems worth doing. However, what we actually realize from these studies is that because when we give people something, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a sugar pill or anything, when we tell somebody who has IBS, here you go, here's this thing, we're doing something to treat you, we tend to see a 40% improvement anyway. So what this study actually showed, and the conclusions of this study, was that giving people a leaflet containing information is actually no more beneficial than giving people a sugar pill or giving people no treatment at all. Now, the real issue with this is that a lot of people that we see, they've gone to their GP and they've been given a leaflet on the low FODMAP diet, or even some people haven't even had that. They've literally just been told to go away and try the low FODMAP diet. So actually, this really highlights to us that the current level of care and the current level of support is no better than if we don't give people treatment at all. So we really need to be looking at this and looking at how we can improve this and looking at how we can support people better than just giving them a leaflet containing information. Now, in an ideal world, we'd have everyone under one-to-one support, which obviously we can't do for everybody. And some people can't afford access to treatment and other people can't wait for the wait time that it takes to be referred. So we don't live in an ideal world where everyone has one-to-one support. Of course, we would love to if we could, but it really just shows and highlights the issue with the level of care that people get and or lack of care that people get, and how we should actually be trying to improve that if we can. So that was just an interesting thing to leave you on. I have waffled on now for 45 minutes, so I'm going to shut up and give you guys the opportunity to ask any questions that you may or may not have. I'm just going to check the chat box. I can't see any questions on the chat box at the moment. You are more than welcome to put messages in there if you would rather not come off mute and ask a question. But if you would like to ask a question, then please do feel free to come off mute and ask if you would like to. So I'll just shut up and I'll just sit here and wait in case anybody wants to ask a question. I don't know if there's a way that I can view you all. Oh, Samantha, you've come off mute. Is that to ask a question or is it just by accident?
That was accidentally, but yeah,
I can't hear you. Oh, just bear with. Say it again.
My mum was listening and she's learned a lot too, but we are surprised, like, because I have tried gluten-free, but I'm just looking through a few products. Some of the products you have in the cupboard, there's actually one or two ingredients I shouldn't be having right now, so I'm going to have to put out the side. But I think out of all the ingredients, I think the flour is okay, which is good.
Yeah.
Okay, and my pasta's okay, but I've had to adapt to doing gluten-free for a long time. But I'm struggling even today. Like today was my first day doing like a low FODMAP meal for my dinner, but actually surprisingly it turned out all right.
Amazing. Yeah, it's really difficult. And we see, so what I give to people, and what I'll do is I'll give you all my email address at the end of this, so that if you want to be sent, I'm more than happy to send you some of the resources that I have. I give people a food ingredient checklist. So we have foods on there that maybe people don't realize are FODMAP foods, because it doesn't state something like a chickpea or something like that, but it might be a derivative of something that still is a high FODMAP food. So we give people an ingredient checklist to have a look through the ingredients to see whether they can identify it. But as I said, because not everything is in bold, sometimes it can be really difficult to sift through big ingredients lists and to actually be able to identify things. So it can be really difficult.
Yeah, well, absolutely what you said about antibiotics a while ago, it's like a light bulb went off in my head. I knew that because I've had ongoing Helicobacter since 2017. So it's back again. So I'm taking antibiotics again. I really don't want to, but I've just finished the course, and you don't realize, even though you have to take them, what's it going to do to your insides? Like, what's it going to do? Because the symptoms got very bad December, and then I have private healthcare. I'm very lucky, but we just went straight to a gastroenterologist, and yeah, I've just temporarily left his care as of last Monday, and yeah, it's basically wrote down low FODMAP diet, try it for 4 months, see how we do, and then come back and see me and see if your symptoms have got any worse. But yeah, he diagnosed me with severe IBS and colitis.
So have you tried taking a probiotic?
I'm waiting for it. I've called everywhere. Nowhere stocks this probiotic. I don't know what it is. It's VLS3.
Is it one that they recommended?
It's one that they recommended.
Okay. So you just can't get hold of it at the moment?
Can't get hold of it anywhere. And they say they don't stock it, or it's too expensive to sort of bring in because not enough people need it.
Let's have a look what it contains. So there's a probiotic that I tend to recommend to people. There's a few different things that we have to look for in probiotics, which is stuff that I went over in the other webinar that I did. So what we tend to find is that people who have IBS, when I mentioned about alterations to gut microbiomes earlier, we tend to find that they are low in lactobacilli and bifidobacteria. So those two types of bacteria, we like to make sure that we've got those in the probiotic. The other thing we really have to look for is the CFU score. So the CFU score stands for colony forming unit, and that's a measure of how much bacteria is in that product, which is why we never ever recommend things like yogurt drinks and kombuchas and things like that as a source of probiotics. They're not going to hurt you. You can have them if you want, but they should never replace a probiotic because they don't tend to have high CFU score, and they don't tend to look into how much bacteria is in them. So you want a CFU score of at least 10 billion. The one that I normally recommend to people is about 20 billion CFU. So just make sure that it's got plenty of the bacteria in them.
I just find it so weird that I have tried that before, and all the you just see them in the supermarket. You think, right, that's what I need. That's what I'm going to go home with. You buy it, you take it home, and think it's going to be good for you. It absolutely caused me unbearable IBS cramps for some reason. But yeah, if I'm doing a natural smoothie with, coconut milk I've tolerated very well for months. No had any sort of major reactions to it. So it seems like that's the safe one for me.
Yeah.
So it was. And yeah, all the approved fruits that I put in it, and I've been drinking it over the past few days, and again from picking them up, and just thought maybe because I'm battling H. pylori again, maybe it's something my gut needs to heal a bit. So everything that's in there is not good for it, so I need to heal it a bit more.
Yeah, and it can take time, especially after infection. It can take a while for everything to heal and for the inflammation to go down and for everything to get better. So yeah, I'm just going to read Kirsty's comments. Been doing FODMAP since March, feel that I need to be more committed with my effort. It does require commitment and it is difficult. Before I try to reintroduce, have the support of a nutritionist, but we delayed our monthly appointment, so could try to see the GP for antibiotics. So they would need to test you first to see whether that's something that you need. But if that is something that you would need, then that's something they can do. Probiotic gave me tummy cramps too. So one thing to just be aware of with probiotics, if they do seem to upset your stomach, Some probiotics that you buy also contain prebiotics, and sometimes they contain the fructooligosaccharides or the galacto-oligosaccharides or the fructans and things like that. So sometimes you buy a probiotic and at the face of it, it looks like it's just a probiotic. But when you actually go into the ingredients list, they also contain prebiotics, some of them, not all of them. So if they also contain prebiotics and the prebiotics that they contain are FODMAPs, then that might also cause you issues. So that's just something to really be aware of. If you've taken a probiotic and it seems to have given you tummy cramps, is just have a look on the ingredients list and check that it doesn't contain prebiotics as well. If it doesn't and it still gives you tummy cramps, then it might just be that you just need to try a different one. Sometimes, it is a bit of trial and error, and we just have to try a few things before we find the one that works well for us. So the one that I tend to recommend to people is one on a website called HealthSpan, and it's their Super 20 probiotic. It contains bifidobacteria and lactobacillus. It contains sort of 5 strains of those bacteria, and it's got a really, really high CFU score, so it's really good quality, and it doesn't contain any of those prebiotics. So hopefully it shouldn't cause stomach upset. Diana, you've got your hand up. Do you have a question?
Yeah, hi there. Thank you so much for this talk. Sorry, could you tell me who supplies the Super 20?
It's a company called HealthSpan.
Right.
They're not anyone that I've got a link with or anything like that. It's just purely a company that make a really, really good quality probiotic.
Right, that's lovely. Sorry, I was writing the other bit down and I missed the name. Right, I've been on the FODMAP for a long time. Now, the reason for that is I started to get a lot of digestive issues when I was diagnosed with 2 autoimmune diseases, well, actually 3, Sjogren's, thyroid, and fibromyalgia.
Okay, yeah.
Now, I started on the FODMAP, and it's been really good. I saw a dietitian at my doctor's. She gave me the booklets. I've done it from there. But what I also did with this is that I did portion control and calorie counting. So because I needed to. But when I started, I had chronic, and I mean chronic acid, where I was being woken up in the middle of the night with it coming out of my nose. I had bloating as if I was 9 months pregnant. I was being sick a lot of the time, and I alternated between constipation and chronic diarrhea, although it was more chronic diarrhea. Now, the reason I've been on it for so long was because my doctor did a lot of tests, and a lot of the tests that came back there were problems with the tests. So I said to her, I've been on it for a while now, shouldn't I be reintroducing? So she said, no, let us do these tests first. Let's get all the tests cleared up, which we did. I've had to have cameras both ends, and loads of blood tests and lots of other things. I've got the all clear. Everything's all clear. Now, what I've started to do is I've just started recently to reintroduce, and I see what you mean by keeping it under the threshold and stepping up, because let's say, for instance, I did 3 slices of bread. I've worked out that I can do 2 and be comfortable. Third one causes the problem. So I'm doing those. I've passed quite a lot of them. But the thing is what you were saying about, because I've been on this since last September.
Yeah.
So would you, and a lot of my problems have disappeared, and even the toilet issues finally are settling down to what I call nearly normal.
Okay.
So would you suggest that I took a probiotic? Because
yes, so if your symptoms have significantly improved from what they were, then that would normally be the point where we would then say, okay, we're ready to start re-challenging. Obviously, we ideally don't want somebody, if possible, to be on this elimination phase for more than 6 weeks. So because you have been on the elimination phase for quite a while, it potentially would be beneficial to take a probiotic just in case it has caused any gut microbiome damage. So that is an option, and it's something that, so with a probiotic, you normally need to take it every day for about 4 weeks. After 4 weeks, you should have a pretty good idea by that point if it's going to help or if it's not. If you don't seem to think that it's made much difference after that time, it's possibly not going to help. But if you do feel that it seems to have made a difference, then it's worth carrying on for a little bit longer. We normally say about 2 to 3 months and then slowly weaning off it. If you are feeling, significantly better to where you were before, then I would say that it's definitely a good time to start doing the re-challenges, because if you do eat something that then does seem to cause you symptoms, if you're in a relatively good place now and you think that you would notice an increase in symptoms, then that's something that's worth considering, because we want to keep you on that restrictive phase for the least amount of time that we possibly can. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, I'm reintroducing now and I've passed quite a few. What it has done, though, is that in the time that I've been on this, I have not eaten any processed foods whatsoever.
Okay.
I've done no substitutions, no processed foods. And to be honest, I don't want to go back to that way of eating anymore. So what I would like to have is some garlic bread and some hummus. Just one more thing that I wanted to ask you about. What is the problem with, because I have this every single time, jacket potato, if I cook one from scratch, I don't have a problem. If I reheat a potato, the starches, I am polaxed. Now, I read something to say that you shouldn't eat reheated starches like a jacket. I can't have a McCain's frozen one because I end up with a stomach ache. Is that right, or is it something that I just have to keep doing trial and error?
To be honest, it's not something I've actually ever come across before. Sort of a food being fine with a food but not being fine with the exact same food if you reheat it. That's not something that I've come across before. However, what I would say is, if you've kept a food and symptom diary and it is very clear that that is something that is causing you an issue, then I would trust that, because we're all different, we all have different issues, and it may be that for whatever reason that is causing you an issue. So if you can be very, very confident that you've done that enough times to know for sure that that definitely seems to be causing you an issue, then I would say trust that, and trust that that's something that you need to avoid.
Yeah, second time I ended up in hospital, yeah, I avoid it now. So yeah, that's just another one that's bitten the dust. Thank you so much. I really appreciate what you've done. Thank you.
So we've just got a message from Samantha saying that you have duodenitis and can the low FODMAP diet help, and that you've had an endoscopy a couple of weeks ago, right? So I presume that you were then diagnosed with that. It's not something that's indicated for that. So when we're thinking of the low FODMAP diet and what it's indicated for, it's indicated specifically for IBS. And when we think of what things are indicated for, what we mean by that is, what have the studies been shown, what have the studies been done on, and what have those studies been shown to be effective for. Now, I don't know off the top of my head if there are studies that have looked at that and looked at whether the low FODMAP diet improves symptoms of that, but I certainly know that it's not something that the low FODMAP diet is indicated for. So potentially it might not help. But as I said earlier, the low FODMAP diet can sometimes mask symptoms of other conditions. So there's a chance that it might help, but it's certainly not something that it would normally be indicated for. Sharon said, is there a way to test your gut microbiome? Unfortunately, there isn't. It would be wonderful if we could. And just to sort of put out there as well, if you do see a test that says that you can do that, don't trust it. I spoke about this really in depth in the other webinar that I did, but any sort of food intolerance test kits that you can buy online, they are a complete load of rubbish. They're not evidence-based, they don't work, and they don't tell you anything. So if you see a test that tells you that you can test for your gut microbiome, don't believe it, it's not true. You can't unfortunately test. You can have a stool sample done, which can give some indication. So for example, in the reason that we know that there's differences between people with IBS's gut microbiome and people who don't have any issues gut microbiome is from studies which look at stool samples. So obviously you have lots and lots of bacteria within your digestive system. From time to time, that bacteria reaches the end of its life. And when it reaches the end of its life, it will pass through your digestive system and come out in your poo. So we can do stool samples, and we can look at the sort of microbiome of your poo and see how that's different between different people. It's not something that I think you'd ever get on the NHS, because it's not something that's routinely done. Obviously, they can do stool samples to look for things like inflammation. They normally measure something called fecal calprotectin, which is a protein which measures inflammation. And then you can have a FIT test done as well, which is the bowel cancer screening test, which looks for blood in your poo. But I think you would probably have to be part of a study or something like that to have your sort of the microbiome of your poo tested, unfortunately. So there isn't a way to test it. The only way to sort of establish whether a probiotic is right for you really is to take a probiotic and to wait for about 4 weeks and see whether you feel an improvement in your symptoms. If you don't, then it's probably not something that's going to help you. If you do, then carry on for a little bit longer and then wean off it slowly. Hazel says, can you recommend bread? I'm celiac and have lactose intolerance and also IBS. So in terms of gluten-free breads that are also low FODMAP, the brand called, I think it's pronounced SCAR, but I'm really sorry if I've got that wrong, but it's SCHAR. They do some breads which are low FODMAP, and they are a gluten-free brand. So they're a gluten-free brand. That's kind of what they do, but their breads tend to be low FODMAP as well. So that's a good one to go for if you're looking for something that's gluten-free and FODMAP free. Fab, thank you. I have learned lots of great stuff. I'm very glad that you have. Found this very informative, very complex medical history, including celiac. Okay, and then I think SIBO and could hopefully get the breath test done. Can you recommend a SIBO test? Yeah, so again, it would have to be, if you wanted to be tested for SIBO, it would have to be through either the NHS, or if you've got private healthcare, through private healthcare. So don't sort of buy any of these tests that you find online. You would need to do it through like the appropriate medical professional if you wanted to get tested for that. Fab. Does anyone else have any questions? Or have I bombarded you with enough information?
I've got a question.
Yeah, go on then.
Just wanted to ask about the recording from a couple of weeks ago. How?
Okay, yeah. So what I will do, if everyone wants to take down my email address, so if everyone gets a pen or something ready, actually, I might be able to put a message to you all. Yes, everyone in meeting. Right, so my email address is nutritionist@andrahealth.com. I'm going to just write it in the chat box as well. nutritionist@andrahealth.com. Can you just tell me if you can see that in the chat box?
Yes.
Perfect. If you want access to the other recording that I did a couple of weeks ago on the primary interventions, drop me an email and I can send you a direct link to it so that you can watch that. If you signed up via the Facebook page, so on the Facebook event page, there was a link that you needed to click on to fill in your email address. If you've done that, you'll get a recording of today's session as well. If you haven't done that, just go back to the Facebook page, click on the link that was in the description on the Facebook page, and just make sure that you filled in your email address, and then you'll get a link to the recording from today as well. And as I say, if you want the recording from the last webinar that I did, just pop me over an email at nutritionist@andrahealth.com and I can send that to you as well. Is that okay? Fab. Any more questions?
Can I just ask a quick question?
Of course you can.
I tried to reintroduce lactose into my diet, and I developed a load of hives on my hand. Is that kind of a typical reaction to lactose, or is that more of an allergic type reaction?
Yeah, that's, I wouldn't expect that. So yeah, that would probably be more of an immune system type reaction, which isn't necessarily what we see with an intolerance. So when you cut out lactose, did you completely eliminate dairy?
No, so I can tolerate a gluten-free pizza with cheese on. But for milk, I tend to have almond milk.
Okay.
But when I did the lactose challenge, I had yogurt, and it was the yogurt that I reacted to.
And was
after
that
having
something that was in your diet before you went on the low FODMAP diet?
Yeah, I would have had yogurts before, but a long time before. So I've been on sort of restricted diets for a very long time, since I started with I always had IBS prior to children, but then after having children, they kind of escalated and I was diagnosed with celiac disease. And then that was kind of taken away because my symptoms didn't recover. I ended up having a genetic blood test, which then showed that I was negative for celiac disease.
Right. Okay.
So it's all, as it is with all these gut issues, it's quite a long and complicated story for myself. So I've been on kind of a lactose-free, dairy-free sort of diet for quite some time.
So when you reintroduced the yogurt and then you got that reaction, did you then repeat that, or have you only done it that once?
I did it for 2 days on the trot. And then when I started with the hives on my hand, I then stopped the challenge. No.
Okay, so it might possibly be worth trying again, just to see, almost as a confirmation to you that it is that's causing that, because just to rule out that it isn't just some freak coincidence that's just happened to be that it could have been something in the environment or anything that's just, you know, a freak coincidence that it happened to you when you had the lactose. So if you were to do it again, and that was to happen again, then you can kind of be sure that, okay, yeah, this is a thing, and this is not agreeing with me, and this isn't something that I should be eating. Or if it doesn't, then potentially it could have just been a crazy coincidence. So I think possibly just try again, maybe with a smaller amount. And possibly also with doing this, possibly try having it and then having a day off. So have it for one day, but don't have it the next day. See if if you're okay with that. If you are, then have it for a couple of days in a row and just have a little play around with it and see whether it was just some crazy coincidence or whether it is that seems to be causing the issue.
Yeah, I mean, prior to doing the FODMAP diet, my symptoms were just awful, and I would kind of suffer with lots of skin rashes. And then since starting the FODMAP diet, my energy levels have shot up, skin rashes have totally gone, acne, ulcers, so many of my symptoms have just drastically improved. It's just been amazing that I've kind of been suffering with all these IBS symptoms for so long. It's been really difficult doing all the reintroductions because I've felt so well. I've not wanted myself to go back to square one with it all.
That's the problem. And we do see that. We see people and they say, oh, but I feel so much better. Do I have to do these reintroductions or can I just stay? But obviously because of the things that we went through, we do need people to reintroduce things into their diet because ideally go long term, we want people to be cutting out the fewest things that we possibly can so that we don't come into encounter nutrient deficiencies and things like that, especially if women get to sort of 45, 50, and then we're thinking about menopause and we're really getting worried about nutrient deficiencies and making, because women at that age then need even more calcium than someone who's premenopause. So it's just something that we have to be really aware of. So it is important to do the re-challenges. It is a pain after you felt so much better for so long.
Yeah.
But obviously the end result is that then you have a really nice list of things that you know you're okay with and things that you're not, and you can then go on to reintroduce those things that do seem to be okay with you. But I mean, if there are things that you 100% know already that you aren't okay with, then sometimes if someone comes to me and, you know, they're 100% sure that lactose causes their issues and they've had it time and time and time again, in that situation, I would say possibly it's not worth us reintroducing it, because you know it's going to cause you issues. But everything else I would want to reintroduce.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. It's been really interesting.
No problem at all.
Mm.
Does anybody else have any questions, or shall I let you all go to your evenings? Fab. Okie doke. So I'm going to let you all go. As I say, if you filled in the link on the Facebook group, it takes you to our website, our Andra Health website, and you just pop in your email address. Then you will get a link to today's recording. If you want a link to the other recording, please just email me with the email address that I've popped into the chat, nutritionist@andrahealth.com. Or if you have any other questions, then I'm more than happy to answer them. I know that not everybody gets access to a registered professional, and it's not accessible to everybody. So, you know, we obviously want people to be as healthy as they possibly can be when they're going through the low FODMAP diet. So please feel free to drop me an email if you would like to. And other than that, I will, well, maybe I will see you all soon if we put on another one. But thank you all very much for coming. It was lovely to have so many of you and to have so many questions. And I will see you if we do another one. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much.
No problem.
Thank you.
Bye.